Greetings, my fellow book peasants. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit more of a constructive criticism session for the next book that I read, which was The Legend of Ahya, Target of Interest. The goal of this channel is never to disparage an author in any way. I think it takes a lot of dedication and skill to even finish a story that puts any author above 99% of people who say they want to write a story. So I recognize that. At the same time, I have to keep my reviews honest so that people trust what I'm recommending to them. So what I'm hoping for is that my critiques of this book are not only helpful to the author, but also helpful to any aspiring authors out there. Just things to look for, things to be aware of that can just improve your story. Now, before we dive into the critiques of this book, let's just give a quick summary and overview of what this book was about. It kind of gave me like Zootopia vibes, right? Because like the entire world is made up of different types of animals living together, but they live in kind of an urban setting. Taylor is the main character, and she has a tail that has a mouth on it that acts independently from her own wants and desires, sometimes even eating people if it gets a little too hungry. Well, because of this unique feature of her physiology, a lot of people are hunting her for her abilities. Everyone wants to be able to leverage her for something, but what does Taylor want for herself? That's what she has to decide throughout the story. So with that context in mind, let's go ahead and dive into this indie review. The Immersion I gave a 6.5 out of 10. Where I give this author credit is the fact that the world is very unique. You don't often see fantasy authors that branch out from the typical creatures or characters that are kind of tropey, like elves and dwarves and orcs and those type of like stereotypical safe characters. And one of my biggest gripes with fantasy is I think that fantasy, because it's unlimited, should be more exploratory rather than just doing what's safe, especially in the indie realm. So the fact that this author created an entire world of animals that can speak and interact with each other, I think that gets a lot of credit from me. Also, from an immersion standpoint, I thought that the script was an interesting format for the religion. I thought it was intriguing and interesting, added a little bit of depth and mystery that kind of underlied beneath the story. So those were some of the positives of the world building that made it a little bit more immersive and engaging and interesting as I was reading it. Now let's dive into some things that I think need some work. The first thing is I just kind of felt like this book was having a little bit of an identity crisis. Is it urban? Is it fantasy? Is it sci-fi? It just had so many elements from different genres that it didn't really seem to have its own personality or identity as a world. Another thing that takes me out of the immersion experience is when I see things like, unless it's specifically dedicated as an urban fantasy, but because this is a world of animals or, animal speaking creatures, I thought it was weird when they were referencing things like social media and Wi-Fi. That takes me right out of the story because it's too much of like what we have in this world. I think you need to rename it to something else if you're going to use social media or use things like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is just such a universal term for this world that trying to see that word in the context of a fantasy world was very difficult. You have to come up with some other concept of how people communicate with each other, even if they have phones, like, have holographs that they can communicate with each other with or something. But having everyone just use the same mechanics as this world, I didn't like that as much. But that was the only major thing for the world building that kind of detracted from it, other than it was kind of a simple world. I think it could have done a ton more to build this out, but that's all I'm going to say on that particular category. Next up, let's talk about the names. I had to give this a 5 out of 10. Let's start with some positives. The character motivations between the different groups that wanted to capture Taylor were all very interesting. Ari wants respect from her father. Trevor just wants a paycheck. Michael is a little bit more of a mystery. So there's an interesting dynamic between the motivations, even though they all have the same goal. And I do feel like the characters had a lot of potential, but to me, they just felt a little bit shallow. And here's what I mean by that. Let's just get right into it with the dialogue. Everyone on this channel knows how I feel about dialogue. I created an entire workshop on this channel about dialogue because I feel so passionately about it. It's one of those things where if it's not done well, it becomes a detractor to the story. And one of the things that is kind of a problem with this story is the dialogue is very question-answer format, and it doesn't deviate from that very often. And here's what I mean by that. Let me just give a quick example. Now, I could flip to pretty much any page that has dialogue and find something like this, but I picked this one specifically just to highlight it. I'm just going to read the dialogue. I'm not going to do any of the dialogue tags, anything like that. So this was right at the beginning of chapter 6, page 110.
What do you want?
Question.
I'm here to feed you and let you out of your cuffs.
Answer. Like, it just, that type of format, it just doesn't give any depth to the conversation. Like, especially in that setting, people aren't, maybe not as responsive to people that are asking direct questions. There's subtlety, there's nuance, there's secrets, but not with this. So that's what I have issue with. So,
what do you want?
I'm here to feed you.
Is it dinner time already?
Of course not. It is morning. Taraji did not want to disturb you when you fell asleep, so he didn't bother delivering the food.
So another question and answer. Another direct question, direct answer. No nuance, no subtlety, no actions to show frustration or show emotion or to show us this scene at all. So that's just a quick example of what I mean when it was very question answers, very direct. There was very telling type of storytelling because you're using dialogue to just basically get us through the exposition, and I didn't like that. The other thing too is, and this is a good note for authors, accents do not distinguish dialogue for your characters. And there were a lot of accents in this book, but the sentence structure for all of the characters was the same. So they all sounded the same, even though they were using different accents at times. The sentence structure matters, and you should look for ways to distinguish how people speak. And accents can work, but better than accents is just the personality that underlies how someone can communicate. When everyone uses the same sentence, it just sounds bland. My other issue with the characters was just repetitive scenes, especially with Taylor explaining the exact same thing about her tale over and over again. And they were just fluff conversations. It was just filler because we as the audience, as the reader, have heard this conversation about the tale already. So we don't want to hear it again. We already understand it. So when we have to read through the same conversation over and over and over and over again, you either have to find a different way to communicate that to people, show that she's frustrated so she doesn't want to tell people about her tale, or have someone else explain it for her, like, bro, you didn't know this already? Like, you have to find different ways to make that same conversation interesting if you're going to have the same conversation. But again, I felt like a lot of times it was fluff. It was unnecessary. It could have been cut from the story altogether after the initial conversation and tone that we get from it. And her story with the tale's not all. She also tells the story of her childhood and her mother like 10 times. She tells the story of her best friend a bunch of times. And I get that those things have relevance, but once, twice, maybe 3 times max. But again, if you're going to be telling something to the reader 3 times, it better be in a different way, revealing new information. If you're saying the same story 3 times in the exact same format with no new information, it just feels repetitive and it feels a little bit lazy and it feels super unnecessary. So it gets frustrating from a reading perspective when we just feel like we're going in a circle with the story. It's not about what the characters in the book know or don't know. It's about what us as readers know or don't know. Once we know information, you can hint at it again, but don't beat us over the head with it. So dialogue should serve 2 purposes. Either it drives the plot forward or it deepens the character building. If it doesn't do one of those 2 things, it's not necessary. On to the magic. I gave the magic a 6.5 out of 10. I feel like this is the category that has the most potential. How Taylor's tale works was very interesting, but we don't get a ton of like concrete answers about it in this book. I would have liked to see more about why this specific feature is so valuable to everyone. Like, we get hints and glimpses at it, but I would have liked to see a little bit more exploration into why this specific person with this specific trait is such a critical component to everyone's plans. Because the tale can eat people, it can heal people, it can act independently. And those things are all really interesting, but how does it apply to the larger scheme of things? That's what I wanted to see more of. It was also interesting to see that Ari had those like earthbending powers and cybernetic enhancements. So that's interesting, but again, we don't get a lot of answers as to what her powers are and why they matter, or really how magic is integrated in this world. Some people are really surprised by magic, other people treat it like it's a normal everyday thing. So again, that goes back to the identity crisis a little bit. I feel like we needed a little bit more shaping to the magic system and how it is perceived within this world. Let's move right along to the infrastructure, which I gave a 4.5 out of 10. Okay, here's the other thing that I want to tell new authors, aspiring authors, really anyone. When it comes to dialogue, it can be tempting to use different words other than said, because we as authors think, I've said a bunch of times, and I don't want this to feel repetitive to the reader, or I don't want them to notice these tags as much. Using different words for said makes that worse, because we just notice it more because it kind of catches your brain as you're reading. Said kind of blends into the background where like you can skip over it, you can read past it really quickly. So it kind of, even if it gets repetitive, it's easy to blow through as you're reading. As soon as you start throwing in those other words like warned, replied, commanded, queried, demanded, it just becomes jarring to the reading experience because those tags happen so often, and you think that you're writing in a new, creative, fresh way by saying said in a different way, when really it's just creating a less smooth reading experience for the reader. If you don't want to use the word said, you need to focus more on action and description in between the dialogue. So instead of saying he said this, just end the dialogue and then mention something that they're doing, their eyebrows raised, he, stroked his beard, something like that, and then move on to the next dialogue after you kind of paint the picture of what they're doing during the dialogue scene. But replacing just the word said is not a good thing to do. It will impact the reading experience in a negative way. You can do it every once in a while, but replacing said, all the said words with different synonyms for said, is way more of a detractor than just having the word said. That might be just my opinion. Let me know in the comments, but that's how I felt about it as I was constantly being caught up in these different synonyms for said. Second thing, lots of passive voice in this story. So, for instance, instead of saying she ran, you would say something like she began to run. And that is just dragging out the sentence and making it passive so that instead of taking a quick action on something, it's drawing it out in a way that's doesn't really do anything for the prose, doesn't do anything for the story. It's just writing that needs to be cleaned up and cut down. So it's just a matter of consolidating those sentences to be really tight so that you're communicating and driving the story, because too much passive voice just really bogs down the pace of your story. Even if it's an action scene, if you're doing an action scene with passive voice, it just makes it feel slow. Now, on the good side, the plot I feel like was pretty good. I was able to read all of it. I didn't DNF this one. I felt like it had enough potential that I was able to kind of get through the story. But really, a lot of fat needs to be trimmed off of this book. It has potential, but it needs some serious cutting of fluff. Now, my enjoyment of the story, I had to give a 4 out of 10. I think my biggest issue with this was just the length of the book versus the actual progression of the story. The book was like 400 pages, and it could have been reduced to 200 easily, with how repetitive the scenes were. Like, even the scenes throughout the book were all similar. She's captured, she's saved. She's captured, she's saved. She's captured, it's just too repetitive. There needed to be a different way to tell these things, a different situation that we could explain what was going on. And even then, I think that we could just condense this down, because if the scenes are repetitive, they're not necessary. We don't want to read the same thing over and over again. So I just think it really needs to be trimmed down. We don't need to see the same sequence of events over and over again. The other thing that I really didn't like was the tone of this book for the most part, felt very YA because of the storytelling style, what was going on throughout the book, the age of the characters. So it felt more like a YA to me. It didn't feel like an adult fantasy. So when there were those couple of sexual scenes in the book, it just felt super jarring and super out of place with the rest of the story. I didn't feel like it was necessary, especially with the rest of the tone. It feels like it comes out of left field. I don't mind a little bit of spice in stories, but it has to work with the characters and their decisions and the plot and the world. And I feel like it was just kind of thrown in there haphazardly. And it was just too jarring. I think that you have to, again, it's an identity crisis. You have to figure out what this book is and then write to that audience. To me, I just didn't like that aspect of the story. So with all that being said, the overall score for Target of Interest is a 5.3 out of 10. And hopefully this is a good learning experience. Hopefully this is a constructive video that not only the author could take notes from, but also other aspiring authors can learn from, these kind of issues that a lot of readers might have with books. The goal is just to improve our writing as a community. I think that we need to raise the standard, and I just don't think that this one met that standard. I think it needs a lot of work, maybe a second round of editing to really trim it down, and that might help improve the score. For me, also, I'm just one person, so other people might love it. You have to take these opinions and these critiques with a grain of salt. Not everyone is going to love your stories or is going to understand it. That's okay. The goal is just to find your niche audience and market to them. But even with your target audience, I think that this could be better. And that's what I want for these authors, is to reach their full potential. And sometimes that means that there needs to be a little bit harsher critique to the stories if it needs it. But on a more positive note, the cover art I actually thought was pretty good. I enjoyed not only the cover art, but the art that's kind of throughout the book. So you get a good map of the place so that you kind of understand where they're traveling to. At the end of each chapter, there's artwork to kind of show scenes from the book, which I thought was really, nice to have. Again, I felt like that's kind of what made it feel more YA to me, was just the amount of pictures that were in the story to help with the visualization of some of the scenes. So, but I liked them. I thought it was good. I thought the formatting was good. The cover was good. So hopefully this was helpful, and let's get that one added to the shelf. So it looks like it needs some help. That'll do it for today's review. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe, join the Indie Fantasy Club, and be sure to check out my other book reviews that we have on the channel. If you like these critiques and you want a little more depth with what I was talking about, I do have some writing workshop playlists that you can kind of take a look at and see what I look for with good dialogue, good character building. So be sure to check those out as well, and I will see you in the next video.